Welcome to Inside Out, a classification and corrections podcast produced by Equivon Corrections, where we discuss industry trends, hot button issues, and solutions that impact facilities nationwide with thought leaders from around the country. Let's get into it.
Hi, everyone. My name is Priscilla Torres, Project Manager at Equivon Corrections, and your host of Inside Out. On today's episode, we're speaking with Leslie Hill, Director of Classification at the West Virginia Division of Corrections and Rehabilitation. Today, we'll be covering inmate classification and how it has evolved. Leslie, great having you on the show today. So, to start off, can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you got into classification work?
Sure. I started working at the Female Correctional Center in West Virginia. We only have one, where I was a case manager and began doing classification reviews on the female population. I then transferred to a male minimum security facility where we housed a work release and a residential substance abuse treatment unit. So I did classification reviews on those inmates. I eventually transitioned to our central office where I was the residential substance abuse treatment programs manager for about a year and then became the director of inmate classification and movement for the agency. So I've been doing that job for about 9 years.
Wow. So you've moved around quite a bit, gotten
With
different perspectives,
different
right?
perspectives, the female, the male, everything from minimum to maximum security.
So how they differ and
Yes.
needs and so forth, right?
Mhm.
So with all those years of experience that you have, how would you say that the role of inmate classification has evolved since you started?
Well, since I have started, especially, in our state in West Virginia, it's become a lot more objective. Kind of removed all of those subjective factors from
Okay.
it to where we rely on what the classification says for decision making versus what people feel, or just based on what they like, don't like about a certain individual
Can
or a
you
certain crime.
Can you touch on that a little bit
Mhm.
on the subjective piece? I'm
All right.
curious, for those listeners out there that are new to classification,
Okay.
what were some of those subjective
Okay, so the subjective things were that even, if an offender was classified as a minimum level, their name would still be brought before a committee within a specific institution for those officials in that institution to decide whether or not they felt like that inmate could have what we call outside clearance, which is that being able to work out in the community, go to work release, outside crews, all of those kind of things. So if just historically they weren't liked by the staff, they would always be denied. We also used a public risk and an institutional risk scores
okay.
that would hold inmates to a certain classification level, and there's nothing they could ever do to lower that score. And a lot of that was based on just subjective opinions.
So what would you say some of the difficulties were that you faced when they were focusing on that subjective kind of piece, right? Versus
Mhm.
utilizing objective tools. What kind of issues did you see in the institution start to occur or did occur back then and have
Mhm.
changed since?
Some of the things that definitely occurred, and it was more from a globally of
Yeah.
our um, agency, was that we were unable to fill lower level beds.
Okay.
Because even though their classification was saying that they were meeting that minimum level of classification, they still weren't good enough in the eyes of the practitioners to go out into the community to work. So,
So housing, it
housing,
had a huge impact on
a
housing,
huge impact on housing.
which can be difficult, especially if you're dealing with
Mhm.
an overcrowded population. I completely understand. So, what would you say are some of the main goals of inmate classification? Now that we're talking about housing, right? What are the
Mhm.
main goals of inmate classification, and why is it so important in a correctional facility? I mean, in any facility, right, where we're
Mhm.
housing inmates. What are the main goals of inmate
The
classification?
main goals of inmate classification is public safety, offender safety, staff safety, and starting guiding them towards that reentry piece of being productive members of society once they're released. But as far you mean classification should be what's driving the whole boat. That's where all the decision making should come from is what is the inmate's classification level from how many officers there should be on transports to just the type of facility they're in or type of section that they're in. Do they need a hard
Closed
facility,
cells.
or
Yeah.
do they need a dorm style? So the primary goal is making sure you've got the right inmates at the right places to keep everybody safe.
How would you say that facilities tend to balance objective classification tools with professional judgment? So,
We do have the overrides in place.
okay,
So
tell me more.
okay, so we've got mandatory overrides to where if they meet certain, like if they have a murder charge, they're automatically overridden to a level 3. Or if they have a sexual component, they're automatically held to a higher classification versus what they actually score out as. Then we have discretionary overrides that involve security threat groups, mental health, history of violence, and then overrides down as well. If they're in within 6 months to possible release, then we can override them down. And those are very few and far between. All of those discretionary ones are, and they have to come from specific other stakeholders. Like it has to be a referral for mental health
Okay.
to say that
This person can be.
Well, to say that, okay, this inmate has scored out as a level 1 minimum, but their mental health needs are so severe that we don't want to house them in one of our community type facilities.
That's understandable.
Mhm.
So, these overrides, the classification
Mhm.
overrides that you speak of, is there a threshold, or can anybody perform these overrides?
The mandatory ones, they are applied automatically if the inmate meets that criteria. And again, they're very specific. So the discretionary ones have to go through their facility director of classification and then referred to me at the state level to make a final decision on, do we feel that this inmate really
And
does need a different classification level?
do you feel that by keeping those processes in place for those overrides, you kind of minimize the amount of overrides coming through?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because the history of violence is one that staff likes to mark with any little bit of violence in there, that, oh, they have a history of violence. And like, no, that's not what we're looking at. We're looking at
Benefit
that.
max
Yeah,
immediately.
we're looking at that inmate that we're afraid of, that if, we don't raise his classification or her classification, that they're going to hurt themselves, hurt another, escape, something like that, that we're not just looking like, oh, their crime was violent.
Right. So the one that
So,
poses the most risk.
right.
That's understandable. Yeah. I wondered how that, it was a
Mhm.
process you guys are balancing out.
Yes.
How would you say, if we dive deep, right? You just
Mhm.
named a perfect example, our violent population.
Mhm.
If we talk about special populations, which we tend to have in,
Mhm.
inside a facility, right? Whether it's corrections, whether it's jails, how is classification handled differently for vulnerable populations like those with mental illness,
Mhm.
women, maybe youth, or other specific populations that you may have inside?
Okay. Um, One of the things, and we just touched about it in the conference, was our classifications are gender specific. So we did a validation study that broke down each one of the risk factors and made sure that that was a risk factor for the females where it might not have been for the men. So they are not the same classification tools. Same thing with the juveniles, look at completely different things and based on their population, not just a standardized form. And that was all validated and normed through statistical analysis and data and all of those kind of things. So, our other special housing units, We have mental health units. We
Okay.
have dementia units. We have what we consider sheltered housing units that we still look at their classification, but we may allow them to go into that unit depending on the severity of other issues. So, they're a level 1 minimum and they really have some dementia issues, that kind of thing. We're still going to house them at that medium security facility that has the dementia
So,
unit. So we sometimes will overlook to get them in the best. I wouldn't say overlook's not the right word, but we take into consideration what their biggest need is.
Inside Out, a classification and corrections podcast, is brought to you by the professionals at Equivant Corrections. As a team composed of former corrections practitioners, Equivant Corrections provides specialized classification and custody management solutions. From the industry-backed, proven decision tree classification instrument to alternative screenings and robust reporting capabilities, Equivant Corrections provides dedicated solutions to help facilities and corrections departments nationwide become safer and more streamlined. To learn more or schedule a demo today, visit www.equivant-corrections.com.
to ensure their safety
To
and
ensure-
other inmate safety. Do
Right.
you have input from other maybe staff or I know some agencies have
Yes.
psychiatric staff on board.
Whenever we run into situations that pose a real challenge to figure out where to hold or house an inmate, I'll hold a multidisciplinary team
Okay.
meeting to where I'll call in, all the stakeholders. So it'll be medical, it'll be the PsyMed people, it'll be security people, the facilities that are involved that could possibly house this inmate, so we can all come together and really look at the inmate to see what is the best choice for this inmate. And that's where one of those overrides may come in to play, is that, we've all talked about it and no, he can't function in a dorm style, so we're going to have to keep his classification at a little bit higher level.
Okay. Well, so I mean, when you're dealing with special populations, it's evident, right, that you're dealing with some pretty vulnerable individuals. With that said, could you discuss some of the challenges in housing high risk or protective custody inmates, or what some people would refer to as PC inmates,
Mhm.
right? Those, and you mentioned it earlier,
Yes.
about those violent inmates and so forth, or those that
Mhm.
carry that higher risk. What are some of the challenges in housing that you've seen?
The biggest challenges I've seen is keeping those inmates safe even when they may not want to be
Okay.
kept safe, if that makes sense. That they feel like they could go live in general population at one of our facilities, but they pose a risk to either themselves or someone else. Or they pose a risk in the sense that they're going to harm someone else or someone else is going to harm them regardless of where you put them. So, and then the facilities don't always like to have that
Individual.
hanging over them out in general population because there is that risk. And that's, I think, the biggest challenge is
That
getting those
resistance from that
and
inmate.
getting those difficult to manage inmates to the right place despite outlying factors.
Right, right. So those individuals with specific offenses that maybe
Mhm.
might be a little vulnerable in general population, or they feel that they can be out there, or they
Mhm.
are not aware, of their mental health status and so
Correct.
forth. What role does classification play in preventing violence or incidents within a facility? So you just kind of touched
Mhm.
on a little bit of that. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, if you are, reviewing your data, reviewing all of your information, you should be able to see trends in numbers regarding violent disciplinary actions, uses of force, escapes, assaults on staffs, assaults on other inmates, those kind of things. So it should be you should be seeing the trend that those are higher in your maximum security facilities versus your lower classification facilities. So,
Okay.
you know,
Well,
except for the escape.
escape.
The escape, you kind of expect there to be more walk-offs from your community facilities, but those aren't true, climbing the fence, aggressive type
Yeah.
escapes.
Right. No, right. They just walked
They
off.
walked or they didn't come back from their work assignment, that kind of thing.
Right.
So, I can tell by looking at the numbers if something's working or something
Isn't working.
isn't working, that, or you see, okay, or which facilities are implementing things correctly based off of those kind of numbers. Whenever I have our research department send me those numbers, I can look and see that, like, hey, this jail has had a whole lot of assaults, uses of force, incidents, special incidents, those kind of things, where I can look and say, okay, this one hasn't. So what are we doing right at this particular institution and not at this one? And what can maybe change? So I use a lot of that
to kind of help.
to kind of guide decision making.
How would you say, so that leads me to ask, I know we talked about high risk and PC inmates. We're talking about violence here. Sometimes we know some of that violence can stem from our gang, our inmates that are, gang involved while they're incarcerated, or just overall, they have that gang affiliation. How do you evaluate and respond to known enemies, or as some refer to keepaways or gang affiliations? How do you guys deal with that? Because I hear often, just talking to, people at different facilities, we run into this issue where, everyone's an enemy, right? And they keep everyone away. Like, how do you guys evaluate and respond to some of that, to kind of minimize putting 15 keepaways or enemies on one inmate, and then they can't move anywhere, right? Because those enemies are all over. How do you guys deal with that?
Okay, now within our the actual prison system, not the jail, we require there to be verified information. So it can't just be a I don't like you or I don't like him, so I don't want to be housed with them type of situation, or I'm going to fight, or whatever. There has to be something verified, whether it's through court order, whether it's co-defendants, whether it's incidents, whether it's prosecuting attorneys calling and being like, there's going to be an issue if these inmates are housed together. We do that on the jail side as well, only they're a little more, they don't require as much verified information, so sometimes they will get a lot of separations put on them while they're at the jail for various reasons, because there's not a lot of information sometimes when they come into the jail. So they try to work through it the best they can and figure out what's legit and what's not.
And by interviews and assessing, it sounds like that's how you guys are able to eliminate.
Yes, and then some research. They might initially separate until they can, figure out a better
solution
way.
Or until they get additional information.
Correct. And then, then we can move them around. We do have the ability to move them around because we do have the 10 different jails that we have. So as long as they don't have court things like that pending, we can move them around.
Well, you're lucky to have those 10 additional spaces to move around.
So if there's a big issue that we can say, let's move this one here, this one here, this one here, and just keep them completely separated. So we do our best to not house them together whenever there's that. Well, absolutely, when there's verified information, we don't house them together.
So with that said, how would you say historical data, right? How does historical data influence current classification decisions?
Definitely does. We definitely keep, those static things of we consider prior convictions, prior disciplinaries for certain amounts of time. And then, their current, and we definitely look at the data just in general for all of it, going back in some cases 15 years or more for some of the serious write-ups.
Okay. So write-ups, you're looking at historical data, like charges, right?
Charges, disciplinary, well, prior charges, disciplinary,
Convictions.
convictions. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And that's how you're able to kind of make those classification
Correct.
decisions and kind of determine, hey,
Mm-hmm.
there's something we always say at Equivant, right? The best predictor of
Past behavior is future, or
or
future
behavior
behavior is past behavior.
See, you
Yes.
remember.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. So yes, I mean, that's the beauty of classification. It just kind of is what it is. And
So would you say that it's important to continue to do like ongoing data reviews and classification reviews? How important would you say that?
I think that is absolutely important. Probably one of the most important pieces that a lot of places tend to look over because it shows you what those trends are. That shows you, things that have changed in 10 years because, the corrections that it was in the 1980s is not the corrections that it is now or even, 10 years ago.
Or is that inmate the same inmate
Right.
they were, 20
Right.
years ago?
So yes. So we can't, as a 20-year-old who had a robbery, should that still really be held against him so much
in his 50s
30
or
years
30s,
ago?
yeah.
And, he's tired, he's not doing those kind of things, and he's been out in society and had lived maybe, pretty productively and then came back in on maybe a nonviolent charge. Kind of weighing that out with the political realities of what people don't want to see in their backyard as far as, work crews and
Right.
those kind of
Well,
things.
so, okay. I mean, that it has changed, right? And you
Yes.
have a lot of years in that you've been
Mhm.
working in this field. Could you think of maybe one of the toughest classification decisions you've ever had to
Hmm.
make and share that with us? And what
Um,
did you learn from it?
Well, I've been fortunate enough that through the whole time my tenure of actually being the director of classification, I have been under an objective classification, and I'm pretty good with understanding how we get there, those kind of things. So pretty much, I go with the classification, but sometimes we have situations that come up when we're trying to decide if someone can really go to work release, if they're going to be approved, that kind of thing. And sometimes it comes down to what the actual charge is, whether it's maybe not morally what people would expect, but it's not necessarily violent either. And it was a case of someone that had done some grave robbing or
Mhm.
breaking into crypts, and people didn't want to let this particular inmate go to a work release setting. And we had to make that call and that decision that while that crime may not be morally, acceptable, it's not necessarily violent either. So that would probably be one of the most difficult
Well,
ones
that's a
I've
first for
had.
me.
Yeah, that I've had
I don't
to.
think I've ever heard that one.
Yeah, that was one for me that, we really had some discussion and throw back and forth about, and, getting like, is this really a violent crime or is it,
Yeah.
something we're not comfortable with? And
That's where that subjective piece kind of
that's where that
lies.
subjective
You
piece,
push it away
and you have to, be like, it's not violent.
yeah,
Okay,
and make
so
your decision.
right.
So I know that you mentioned early on, right? You also cover the division of rehabilitation. So I'm
Mhm.
assuming that also covers reentry.
Yes.
So with that said, in your view, right,
Mhm.
what improvements are most needed in the way facilities approach classification today?
I think still removing to accepting what the classification says and removing their personal opinion from it, even while on paper, the inmate says minimum, they still want to hold on to that inmate like they're maybe higher because of their personal opinions.
Okay, so just kind of removing those biases.
Yes, still more so. Actually,
Yeah.
just them actually fully, wholeheartedly trusting in the classification.
On that piece.
Mhm.
how do you see classification evolving with technology or criminal justice reform?
With technology, I mean, I would assume AI would start playing some kind of a piece in it as we progress. And just the information sharing between agencies
Okay.
that, I've been able to even experience now. We share information between our state police and some of the magistrate courts and things like that we can get easily prior information
Which would make those decisions.
decisions more efficacy in those decisions that we have looked into them as thorough as we possibly can, where before some of that stuff might have been hidden or not known about. So technology is allowing us to get a clear picture of that inmate.
Okay. So, what advice would you give someone just entering the corrections field and working in classification for the first time?
Okay.
If now that you could go back to the
Right.
beginning, like, what would you tell someone or younger you, right?
Yes.
Just like,
Yeah. I would tell them to just be objective, to do a thorough review, notes, take lots of notes. When in doubt, check it out even farther. Go to someone, who's a little more experienced, but to just trust, especially if they have a validated instrument within their agency, to trust that instrument, what it says.
well, Leslie, I appreciate you taking the time today to, sit down and cover some of
Mhm.
these difficult questions about classification and you sharing your experiences with us.
Mhm.
So we appreciate you. We hope we can see you again in the future.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
This episode of Inside Out, a classification and corrections podcast, was brought to you by Equivon Corrections. For more information regarding classification and/or custody management software solutions that can save your team time and mitigate your facility's risk, visit www.equivon-corrections.com.